The air was thick with an eerie luminescence, a soft glow emanating from the strange flora of the alien moon. Ethan Carter stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the bioluminescent moss with each step. His ship, now a smoldering wreck behind him, was irreparable. He had activated every distress beacon, but there was no guarantee that anyone would receive them in this uncharted sector. He ran a hand through his tousled dark brown hair, his green-gold eyes scanning the surreal landscape. This place was alive in a way he couldn't quite describe. The air carried a subtle hum, almost like a song at the edge of his perception. As a xenobiologist, he had seen bizarre ecosystems before, but nothing quite like this. The entire environment felt synchronized as if it was breathing in harmony. A rustling sound snapped him from his thoughts. Instinctively, he reached for his sidearm. Useless now, thanks to the electromagnetic field that had fried his ship's systems. His heart pounded as he turned to face the movement. Emerging from the shadows was the most striking being he had ever seen. She was tall, her body sleek yet athletic, moving with a grace that made the very air seem to bend around her. Her skin was silver blue, shimmering faintly under the bioluminescent glow. Deep violet eyes, rimmed with golden rings, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill through his spine. Long strands of iridescent black hair cascaded down her back, catching the dim light like woven stardust. But what caught his attention most was the way her bioluminescent markings pulsed along her arms and collarbone, responding to her breath. She was beautiful, but there was something dangerous in her stillness. She was studying him just as intently as he was her. Ethan swallowed, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I didn't mean to intrude. My ship crashed." His words died in his throat as he realized what she was wearing. Or rather, what she wasn't. The alien woman stood before him, unclothed, her markings glowing in rhythmic patterns across her exposed skin. It wasn't just nudity. It was ceremonial, ritualistic, something beyond his understanding. He had seen enough of alien cultures to recognize that this was sacred. He had just walked into something he was never meant to witness. Before he could move, she was suddenly in front of him, faster than any human could react. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her touch cool yet electric. Ethan tensed but forced himself to stay still. "You should not be here," she said, her voice low, melodic, but edged with warning. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, his voice steady despite the rapid beat of his pulse. "I crashed. I wasn't looking for whatever this is." Her golden-ringed eyes narrowed, searching his face for deception. After a long silence, she exhaled slowly, her grip tightening. "You saw what you should not have seen." Her markings flared as if emphasizing the severity of his transgression. "You cannot leave." Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean, I can't leave?" Her expression remained impassive, but there was something restrained beneath the surface. "The ritual you witnessed is sacred. It is a bonding ceremony. You have seen it. That means you are now part of it." His stomach dropped. "Part of it?" His mind raced, trying to process the implications. "You're saying I'm what? Bound to this, to you?" Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed again, but this time they flickered unevenly, almost hesitantly. "Until the bond is complete, you cannot leave. The planet itself will not allow it." Ethan's jaw clenched. He had encountered alien cultures with strict rituals before, but this was different. The way she spoke, the confidence in her tone, it wasn't just a cultural belief. It was something real. "I can't accept that," he said. "I didn't come here by choice. I need to get off this planet." Her gaze did not waver. "Then you must bond with me." A heavy silence fell between them. Ethan's mind rebelled against the idea. He had spent years pushing people away, fearing what attachments could cost him. Now, fate had placed him in a situation where his only chance at survival was to embrace the very thing he feared most. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I don't even know your name." A flicker of something crossed her face, surprise, maybe curiosity. "Aelyna," she said softly. "Aelyna," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. His pulse still pounded, but beneath the anxiety something else stirred. A realization. Whatever was happening here, whatever bond she spoke of, it had already begun the moment their eyes met. Ethan's mind raced as Aelyna's words settled over him like an inescapable weight. The ritual, the bond. There was no way she meant it literally. No force in the universe could tie him to a stranger through some ancient alien custom. And yet, standing before her, feeling the quiet thrum of energy between them, he wasn't sure anymore. Aelyna's grip loosened, though she did not release him entirely. Her golden-ringed eyes studied his face, waiting. For what, he wasn't sure. Maybe for him to accept or to understand. But understanding was far from his grasp. He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "Look, I don't know what kind of ceremony this is, but I don't belong here. If there's some way to fix my ship, the field won't allow it." Her voice remained calm, but there was something final in her tone. The energy that pulses through this world, it binds all life within it. Those who do not belong to it remain trapped unless they form a connection strong enough to be accepted. Ethan's stomach twisted. That's not how physics works. Aelyna tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "This place is beyond your physics." His frustration flared, but he forced himself to push it down. Arguing with her wouldn't get him anywhere. If the planet had an environmental lock keeping him here, then there had to be a scientific explanation for it. And if there was an explanation, there was a solution. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing for a moment before turning back to her. "All right, let's say I believe you. What exactly does bonding entail?" The word itself sent a strange shiver through him, though he wasn't sure if it was dread or something else entirely. Aelyna hesitated, her markings dimming slightly. "The bond is a union of essence. It is not a contract, not a prison. It is shared will." Her gaze flickered downward for the first time, a small crack in her composed exterior. "It must be chosen." He folded his arms. "And if I don't choose?" She lifted her eyes, the golden rings around her pupils expanding, and for a moment he felt as if she was seeing through him, beyond flesh, beyond words, to the place where all his fears lay hidden. "Then the planet will never release you." A flicker of fear shot through him, but he shoved it aside. There had to be another way. If he could understand the force keeping him here, he could find a way to neutralize it. His eyes drifted over the landscape, searching. The air still thrummed with that strange, distant hum, vibrating through his bones in a way that was almost soothing, almost familiar. He had dismissed it as ambient energy before, but now he wasn't so sure. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic. He turned back to Aelyna. "You said this energy field, this force that keeps me here, it's tied to the planet, right?" She nodded slowly. "It is the lifeblood of our world. And you said I need to be connected to it to leave." Aelyna remained silent, but he could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She understood what he was asking before he did. He inhaled deeply. "Then maybe I don't need to bond with you. Maybe I can bond with the planet itself." Aelyna's expression darkened, and for the first time since meeting her, he saw something close to panic in her gaze. "That is not how it works." "How do you know?" Ethan challenged. "If this planet functions like a living organism, then maybe there's another way to know." Her voice was sharper this time, urgent. "The planet does not bond with individuals. It bonds through us, through the connection we create. If you attempt to force your way in, it will reject you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You mean it'll kill me?" Aelyna did not look away. "Yes." A cold weight settled in his chest, so that was it. He had no way off this planet except through her. A long silence stretched between them, the pulsing glow of the landscape casting shifting shadows across her face. Finally, Ethan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This isn't fair." "No," Aelyna agreed. "It never is." He glanced at her then, really looking at her, and for the first time he saw the weight in her own posture, the quiet resignation in her voice. She wasn't just enforcing some law of her people, she was bound by it too. Whether she wanted this or not, she had no more choice than he did. A new thought struck him. You said the bond has to be chosen. His voice was careful now. What happens if I refuse? If I don't bond with you, what does that mean for you? Aelyna hesitated, then lowered her gaze. Then I remain unbonded. Something about the way she said it made his throat tighten. It wasn't just a matter of ritual. It was personal. Ethan took a slow breath. He was standing on the precipice of something he didn't fully understand. If he took one step forward, there would be no turning back. But if he refused, he didn't finish the thought. He wasn't ready to. Instead, he met her eyes. Then show me. His voice was steady. Show me what it means. Aelyna studied him for a long moment as if deciding whether he meant it. Then, with a soft breath, she lifted a hand, palm up. Ethan hesitated only a fraction before placing his hand over hers. A warmth spread between them, something deeper than touch, deeper than sensation. A pulse, synchronized between his heartbeat and hers. And for the first time, Ethan felt it. The bond wasn't something forced. It wasn't a trap. It was a choice. And in that moment, he wasn't sure which scared him more, that he had to make it or that part of him already had. Aelyna's fingers curled around his, her grip neither forceful nor weak, just steady. The warmth between their palms deepened, spreading up his arm like a slow-moving current. It wasn't just physical. It was something else, something deeper. Ethan clenched his jaw against the instinctive urge to pull away. He had spent his whole life avoiding connections, keeping people at arm's length. It was easier that way, less painful when they were gone. But now, standing here, holding the hand of an alien woman he barely understood, he felt something unraveling inside him. Aelyna's violet eyes searched his, the golden rings shifting in a slow, deliberate pulse. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured. Ethan swallowed. He didn't want to admit it, but lying would be pointless. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "I feel something." Aelyna's expression was unreadable. "The bond is not just between two people," she said. "It is a connection to the world itself, a thread woven into the fabric of life." Her free hand rose, touching his chest lightly just over his heart. "If you resist, it will fray. If you accept, it will strengthen." Ethan's breath hitched at the contact. Her touch wasn't invasive, but there was something unnervingly intimate about it. He was hyper-aware of her proximity, the way her bioluminescent markings flickered in tandem with her breath. "You still don't trust it," she observed softly. He exhaled sharply. "Can you blame me?" Aelyna didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest. The warmth spread deeper, wrapping around his ribs like unseen tendrils. It wasn't unpleasant. If anything, it felt natural. Like something long buried inside him was being unearthed. "The bond will not take from you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It will only ask." Ethan's throat tightened. That was the problem, wasn't it? He had spent so long running, avoiding anything that required giving a piece of himself. Even before the disaster that took his crew, he had built walls around himself. But Aelyna, this planet, wasn't demanding anything from him. They were offering, and somehow that made it worse. Aelyna stepped back, letting go of his hand. Instantly, the warmth vanished, leaving behind a cold emptiness that made his breath hitch. He hadn't realized how much he had been leaning into it. Her gaze remained steady. "You must choose, Ethan Carter." The way she said his name sent a shiver through him. No one had ever spoken it quite like that before, as if it was something important. As if he was something important. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. "And if I say no, if I refuse?" Aelyna's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. "Then you remain a fragment, lost, untethered. The planet will keep you, but you will never belong to it." She paused. "And I will remain unbonded." Ethan's stomach twisted. "That matters to you." Her markings pulsed faintly. It should not, but it does. A long silence stretched between them. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, steady but erratic. He looked around at the glowing expanse of the world around him, the faint hum that he could now feel rather than just hear. This place was alive in ways he couldn't explain, and somehow he was becoming part of it. Finally, he exhaled. "Then tell me what I have to do." Aelyna studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Come with me." She turned, her iridescent hair flowing behind her, and began walking. Ethan hesitated only a second before following. They moved through the glowing landscape in silence. Ethan noted the way the flora shifted in color as Aelyna passed, responding to her presence. The trees swayed gently despite the absence of wind, their elongated leaves whispering softly. He could feel the energy beneath his feet, a rhythm that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Aelyna led him to a clearing where a small, shimmering pool of liquid stretched before them. The water wasn't just reflective, it seemed alive, shifting between deep blues and soft violets. She stopped at the edge and turned to face him. "This is the Nexus," she said. "It is where the bond is sealed." Ethan eyed the water warily. "I'm not going to drown, am I?" Aelyna's lips quirked slightly. "Not if you trust," he huffed, crossing his arms. "You really like that word, don't you?" Her expression softened. "It is the foundation of all bonds." Ethan looked at the pool again. He could feel something emanating from it, a quiet invitation. He wasn't sure if it was the planet or Aelyna herself, but it called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. Taking a slow breath, he stepped forward. Aelyna watched him carefully, her own posture shifting slightly as he approached. He could see something in her eyes now, something unguarded. She wasn't just leading him through a ritual. She was waiting, hoping. Ethan reached the water's edge and hesitated. The warmth from earlier still lingered faintly in his fingertips, a whisper of what had passed between them. He turned to her, searching her face. "If I do this," he said slowly, "it has to be real, not just some forced connection." Aelyna nodded. "It will be real if you allow it." Ethan exhaled, then stepped into the water. The moment his foot touched the surface, the energy surged through him, not painful, not overwhelming, just right. And in that instant he knew. He was no longer just an outsider. He was becoming part of something. The moment Ethan stepped into the shimmering pool, a warmth unlike anything he had ever known enveloped him. It wasn't water in the way he understood it. There was no resistance, no weight dragging him down. Instead, it felt as though he was being drawn into something vast, something alive. The colors beneath his feet rippled in response to his presence, shifting in luminous waves of violet and gold. Aelyna stepped in beside him, her bare feet gliding effortlessly over the surface. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, syncing with the faint hum Ethan could now hear, not just in the air but inside of him. "Close your eyes," she said gently. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't good at letting go, at surrendering control. But here, in this moment, resistance felt futile. He let his eyes flutter shut. Aelyna's fingers brushed against his, light as a breath. "Breathe with me," he inhaled, matching her rhythm. As he did, something shifted. The hum he had been feeling all along deepened, reverberating through his chest, his bones. A presence surrounded him, not just Aelyna, not just the planet, but something deeper, something older. He felt as though the very air was pressing against his skin, mapping him, learning him. A rush of sensation flooded his mind. Not images, not words, just emotions, belonging, acceptance. A memory that wasn't his own surfaced, flickering across his consciousness like a dream. Aelyna, standing in this very pool, her gaze locked on another, someone who wasn't there anymore. A bond that had never been completed, a choice never made, pain. Ethan's eyes snapped open and he found Aelyna staring at him, her expression unreadable. But her eyes betrayed something else, vulnerability. "You felt it," she murmured. Ethan exhaled, his pulse quickening. "That was you." Aelyna didn't deny it. The bond is not only a merging of presence, it is a sharing of truth. Ethan looked away, his chest tightening. This was deeper than he had anticipated. It wasn't just a ritual, a cultural formality. It was exposure in its purest form. It was laying yourself bare, trusting someone to see you as you truly were, that terrified him. Aelyna tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his. "You are afraid." Ethan forced out a breath, shaking his head. "This isn't what I expected." Her lips parted slightly, almost as if she wanted to say something else, but instead she reached out, her fingertips barely brushing his chest. "Let go," she whispered. "If you fight it, it will break." Ethan swallowed. His instinct screamed at him to pull back, to shield himself. But something else, the warmth in her voice, the way her markings pulsed with unspoken emotion, held him there. Slowly he let go. The energy surged around them, and suddenly he was no longer just standing in the pool. He was inside it, not submerged but woven into it. His body remained, but his mind, his essence, was being intertwined with something vaster. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Aelyna's presence surrounded him, not just physically but in a way he couldn't explain. He felt her emotions as if they were his own, her hesitation, her longing, the weight of her duty pressing against her soul. And underneath it all, the fragile hope she had never spoken aloud. She had been waiting for him, not him specifically, but someone. Someone who would not be bound by duty or tradition, but by choice. Someone who would choose her. The realization struck deep. Ethan had spent so long running from attachment, from the idea of belonging to something more than himself. He had told himself it was safer that way, that it was necessary. But now, standing here with Aelyna, feeling the unguarded truth of her presence merging with his, he knew. He didn't want to run anymore. His fingers curled around hers, a conscious choice, and the moment he did, the energy around them flared. The bond had begun. Aelyna inhaled sharply, her gaze locking onto his. He could see the change in her, the way her markings brightened, the way her pulse quickened beneath his touch. "You are sure?" she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his answer came without hesitation. Yes. The light around them exploded into brilliance, and the world shifted. The brilliance flared outward, expanding beyond the Nexus pool, casting shimmering waves of gold and violet across the landscape. Ethan felt something anchor itself deep within him, not like chains binding him in place, but like roots sinking into fertile ground. For the first time in his life, he wasn't drifting. He was connected. Aelyna gasped, her fingers tightening around his as the glow pulsed between them, wrapping around their hands, their bodies, weaving their essence together in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable. The energy surged in waves, synchronizing their breath, their heartbeats, their very presence in this place. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light receded. Ethan staggered slightly, his senses overwhelmed. He could still feel Aelyna's presence, within him, around him, as if an invisible thread now tethered them together. It wasn't suffocating, it wasn't forced, it was right. Aelyna's eyes fluttered open, her violet irises swirling with shifting golden rings. She exhaled softly, watching him carefully as if seeing him for the first time. "It is done," she murmured. Ethan flexed his fingers, expecting to feel different, but he still felt like himself. No sudden transformation, no loss of individuality, and yet something had changed. The air felt clearer, the hum of the planet's energy no longer a distant song but a melody woven into his own existence. He looked at her, searching for confirmation. "That's it," Aelyna nodded, but there was something unspoken in her expression, something unreadable. "The bond is formed. The planet recognizes you now." Ethan glanced upward. The sky, which had once carried a weight he hadn't noticed before, felt lighter. The overwhelming presence that had trapped him here, that had held him in its grasp, was gone. He could leave. His stomach twisted at the realization. For days, He had been desperate to escape, to find a way off this moon, to return to the life he had before. But now, as the possibility stood in front of him, it felt hollow. Aelyna turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the bioluminescent trees lining the clearing. Her expression was unreadable, but he could sense her thoughts, the quiet shift in her emotions. This was as much a choice for her as it was for him. Ethan swallowed. "What happens now?" She hesitated before answering. "You are no longer bound by the planet's will. You may leave." A pause. "If that is what you still desire." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The rational part of him knew what he should do. He should call for another rescue attempt, repair what he could of his ship, return to his work, his life. The life he had carefully built around solitude and survival. But the rational part of him no longer felt so certain. His gaze drifted back to Aelyna, to the way her iridescent hair caught the dim light, to the soft glow of her markings as they pulsed in quiet anticipation. He could still feel the bond between them, not in a way that forced his hand, but in a way that made his decision matter. If he left, he would be breaking something fragile, something neither of them had fully put into words. And the strangest part of all, he didn't want to break it. Ethan took a slow step toward her. "What about you?" Aelyna's eyes flickered with something unspoken. "I will remain," he frowned. "And that's enough for you?" A hesitation. Then finally a whisper. "It has always been enough." Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't believe that." Aelyna's expression wavered, the gold in her irises pulsing faintly. "What do you believe?" He took another step closer, his voice steady now. "That you want more, that you deserve more." Aelyna parted her lips slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He could feel her uncertainty, her quiet longing, the years of duty pressing against her shoulders. This had never been a choice for her. Until now. Ethan reached for her hand again, lacing his fingers through hers, ignoring the way his pulse pounded in his ears. "Come with me." Aelyna inhaled sharply. "Ethan, I'm not asking you to leave your people," he interrupted gently. "I'm asking you to choose something for yourself, for once." Aelyna's grip tightened around his, her markings pulsing with a rapid rhythm. For a long moment she said nothing. Then finally her gaze lifted to meet his. "I choose you." The words settled between them, final and certain. Ethan smiled, his fingers brushing over hers. "Then let's go." Aelyna nodded, and together they stepped out of the Nexus pool. The energy around them did not resist, it embraced them. As one, the glow of the Nexus faded behind them as Ethan and Aelyna stepped back onto solid ground, the hum of the planet no longer a barrier, but an understanding presence. The weight that had once held him here was gone, and yet he wasn't in a rush to leave. Aelyna walked beside him in silence, her bioluminescent markings dimming slightly, as if adjusting to the shift in energy. Her choice had been made, but Ethan could feel the quiet uncertainty radiating from her. This was new for both of them. They reached the place where his ship had crashed, a ruined shell, its exterior scorched and shattered. The impact had buried much of it beneath the bioluminescent moss, but it was still recognizable. Ethan ran a hand over the exposed metal plating, his fingers tracing the damage. He had spent days trying to find a way to escape, but now the wreckage felt like a relic of another life. Aelyna stopped beside him, her voice soft. "You still wish to repair it?" Ethan exhaled. "I should." His hand lingered on the ship, but his heart wasn't in the words. "It's what I came here to do." Aelyna tilted her head, watching him carefully. "And yet you hesitate." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah." He turned to face her, his green-gold eyes searching hers. "Because I don't know what leaving means anymore." Aelyna's gaze remained steady. "It does not have to mean goodbye." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. The bond between them still thrummed, quiet but undeniable. The planet had accepted him, and more than that, Aelyna had. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was drifting. He had spent so long running from connection, from belonging. Now he had both, and the thought of walking away from it was unbearable. Ethan inhaled deeply. "If I leave, it won't be the same." "No," Aelyna agreed. "It will not." A long pause stretched between them, and then, to his surprise, Aelyna reached forward, brushing her fingers along his jawline, her touch feather-light. "But we are not the same as we were." Ethan's breath caught at the quiet certainty in her voice. She wasn't asking him to stay. She wasn't pleading. She was simply reminding him of the truth. What they had now wasn't something that could be undone. He reached up, his hand covering hers, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. The connection between them was stronger now, unspoken yet understood. Slowly, he turned back to the wreckage of his ship. There was a way forward. He could repair it, but he wasn't going to leave alone. He wasn't just running to the next mission, the next solitary existence. This time, he had something to return to. He glanced at Aelyna, his lips quirking slightly. "So, you any good with ships?" Aelyna's violet eyes glimmered with amusement, the golden rings expanding slightly. "I learn quickly." Ethan grinned, squeezing her hand once before letting go. "Then let's get to work." Together, they began sorting through the wreckage. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't just trying to escape. He was building a future. The hours passed in quiet synchronicity, Ethan and Aelyna working side by side beneath the glowing sky. The ship was damaged beyond a quick fix, but as Ethan sifted through the wreckage, he found that not everything was beyond repair. The communications relay was salvageable, though heavily corroded. With Aelyna's help, he rerouted power from what remained of the ship's core, hoping to send a signal strong enough to reach any passing vessels. Aelyna worked with precise, fluid movements, her fingers gliding over the ship's foreign metal as if learning it by touch alone. Ethan had no doubt that she would understand the ship's systems faster than most engineers he had worked with. She was adaptable, a survivor in her own right. As she adjusted one of the exposed power conduits, she glanced at him. "This ship, it is important to you." Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaning against the edge of the console. "It was. Used to be my way of keeping myself separate from everyone else. Just me, the ship, and my work." Aelyna's eyes studied him, her bioluminescent markings flickering with quiet curiosity. "And now?" Ethan exhaled, considering his answer. "Now I'm starting to think being separate isn't all it's cracked up to be." Aelyna tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together as if in thought. "Connection is not weakness." "No," Ethan admitted, meeting her gaze. "It's not." Aelyna held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. She reached out, adjusting a broken relay on the console, her movements smooth and precise. The golden rings in her irises pulsed faintly, as they often did when she was focused. Ethan found himself watching her more than the ship. For someone who had lived their life bound by duty, she carried herself with remarkable grace. But now, there was something different in the way she moved, lighter, as if some unseen weight had been lifted. She had made a choice, and though she had once feared it, now she seemed at peace with it. Ethan couldn't deny what that meant for him, either. A sharp beep from the console snapped him from his thoughts. The comm relay flickered, static cutting through the air. Aelyna turned toward the console, her fingers hovering over the interface. "Is it working?" Ethan nodded, adjusting the signal amplifier. "It's sending. Might take a while before someone picks it up." Aelyna considered this, then turned to him. "And when they do," he leaned against the panel watching her. "Then we see what happens next." Aelyna studied him carefully. "You do not wish to return alone." It wasn't a question but a statement, and Ethan didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "I don't." Aelyna's gaze softened and something unspoken passed between them. She had spent her life bound by rules, by expectations. Now she was stepping into something unknown. But she wasn't stepping into it alone. Ethan reached for her hand again, lacing his fingers through hers, and this time there was no hesitation on either side. "We're in this together," he murmured. Aelyna's lips curved into the faintest smile, her markings pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "Yes," she whispered, "together." As the stars above shifted, the signal pulsed outward, carrying their future with it, the days that followed passed in quiet anticipation. The distress signal pulsed outward into the void, its rhythmic transmission the only reminder that, somewhere beyond the bioluminescent sky, there was still a universe waiting. But for now, Ethan and Aelyna existed in the space between, neither trapped nor entirely free, suspended in the quiet certainty of what they had chosen. Ethan found himself adjusting to the planet's rhythms in ways he hadn't expected. The hum of the land no longer felt like an external force pressing against him. It was inside him now, a quiet pulse he had learned to recognize. The trees whispered when the wind did not blow. The ground warmed beneath his feet even when the air was cool. He had become part of this place. And so had she. Aelyna moved with the ease of someone no longer weighed by the past. She guided him through the land, showing him places she had never shown another. Hidden caves where the air was thick with glowing spores, riverbeds where the water shimmered like liquid light. She explained how the planet breathed in cycles, how the creatures that lived here communicated through bioluminescence rather than sound. Ethan listened, fascinated, not just by the world but by her, by the way she spoke when she was unguarded, by the way she smiled when she thought he wasn't looking, by the way she touched his arm when she laughed. And with every passing moment, the bond between them deepened. One evening, they sat by the wreckage of his ship, the sky painted in swirling hues of violet and deep blue. Ethan leaned back against the warm metal, his gaze drifting toward the stars. Aelyna sat beside him, her long, iridescent hair reflecting the dim light, her bioluminescent markings pulsing in slow, steady waves. "The stars seem different from here," Ethan murmured. Aelyna glanced upward. "They are the same, maybe," he tilted his head slightly, "but I think I'm seeing them differently." Aelyna turned to him then, her gaze lingering. "Because you have changed." Ethan met her eyes, something unspoken settling in his chest. "Yeah," he admitted, "I think I have." Aelyna's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached out, brushing her fingers against his. It was not the first time they had touched, but this time it was deliberate, a choice. Ethan turned his hand over, allowing her to lace her fingers through his. The warmth spread between them, steady, certain. "You do not regret this?" she asked quietly. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "No," Aelyna exhaled softly, and something shifted in her expression, something unguarded, something real. "Neither do I." Silence settled between them, not heavy, not awkward, just full. Ethan traced slow circles against her palm with his thumb, memorizing the feel of her skin. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. He let her set the pace, let her decide. Aelyna's breath brushed against his cheek, her violet eyes searching his one last time before she closed the distance. The kiss was soft, unhurried. Not a collision, not an overwhelming force, just a meeting, a quiet understanding. Ethan let himself sink into it, into her warmth, into the gentle pressure of her lips against his. When she finally pulled back, her gaze remained steady, her fingers still intertwined with his. Ethan smiled. "Guess we're really doing this." Aelyna's markings glowed softly. "Yes." A pause. "We are." Ethan exhaled, leaning his forehead against hers. He had spent so long running, so long convincing himself that solitude was safer. But here, in the quiet hum of this alien world, he had found something worth staying for. And as Aelyna curled into his side, her presence grounding him more than any planet ever had, he knew he wasn't lost anymore. He was home. Ethan woke to the soft glow of pre-dawn light filtering through the bioluminescent canopy above. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of alien flora, and the hum of the planet vibrated beneath him like a distant heartbeat. He shifted slightly, feeling warmth pressed against his side. Aelyna. She lay beside him, her head resting just below his shoulder, her iridescent hair splayed across his chest like woven starlight. Her breathing was slow and steady, and her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as his own heartbeat. The sight sent a strange, grounding sensation through him, like an anchor, like a tether that he hadn't realized he had needed. For a long time, he simply lay there, watching the way the shifting hues of the morning sky reflected in her violet eyes as she stirred. When she finally opened them, there was no hesitation, no guardedness. She had let him in, and he had let her in too. Aelyna studied him in the quiet way she always did, as if searching for something beyond words. "You did not sleep much," she murmured. Ethan exhaled, his fingers absently tracing patterns along the back of her hand. "Didn't need to," she arched a delicate brow. "That is not how humans function," Ethan chuckled. "Maybe not, but I think I'm getting used to whatever this is." He gestured vaguely, indicating the bond between them, the quiet connection that had become a constant presence in his mind. Aelyna hummed softly, shifting slightly, pressing closer as if drawn by the same pull. "It will take time." Ethan tilted his head, watching her. "You don't regret it." Aelyna's markings glowed faintly as she lifted her gaze to his. "No." The certainty in her voice was absolute. "Do you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He had spent so long living moment to moment, never allowing himself to stay anywhere long enough to grow roots. Now, for the first time, he wasn't thinking about an escape route. His fingers curled gently around hers. Not even a little. Aelyna studied him for a moment longer before nodding, as if confirming something to herself. Then, slowly, she sat up, stretching her arms above her head. The morning light cast an ethereal glow over her silver-blue skin, illuminating the intricate network of glowing patterns that pulsed with her every breath. Ethan pushed himself upright as well, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Guess we should check the relay," he muttered. Aelyna glanced toward the wreckage of his ship. "Do you expect a response?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know." He ran a hand through his messy brown hair. "I should be hoping for one, but," he exhaled, "it's complicated." Aelyna regarded him carefully. "Because you are no longer certain if you wish to leave." Ethan glanced at her, then nodded. "Yeah." She said nothing, but the look in her eyes told him she understood. They made their way back to the ship's wreckage, the morning light painting the landscape in shades of soft gold and violet. Ethan activated the comm relay, fingers drumming absently against the metal as he checked the frequency. Then, static, his pulse quickened. Someone was out there. A voice crackled through the speaker, barely audible at first. Ethan adjusted the frequency, fine-tuning the signal. "This is the Celestial Dawn responding to your distress call. Transmission received. Identify yourself." Ethan inhaled sharply. It had worked. Aelyna stood beside him, silent but attentive. He turned to her, searching her expression for something, hesitation, concern, but all he found was quiet understanding. He pressed the comm button. "This is Ethan Carter. I'm requesting transport, but..." He hesitated for only a moment before continuing, his voice steady. "There are two of us." Aelyna's markings pulsed faintly, but she said nothing. A long pause followed. Then the voice returned. "Confirmed, Carter. Coordinates locked. We're en route. Stand by." The transmission ended and silence settled between them. Ethan turned to Aelyna, running a hand over the back of his neck. "Still time to change your mind." Aelyna regarded him with a quiet intensity. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I have already chosen." Ethan exhaled, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Good." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And you?" Ethan reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Yeah," he murmured. "I have two." They stood together, hand in hand, as the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't just heading toward another unknown. He was heading home. And he wasn't going alone. Hours passed as Ethan and Aelyna prepared for departure. The hum of the planet no longer felt like a force keeping him bound. It was simply there, a part of him now, a part of both of them. The celestial dawn would arrive soon, and when it did, everything would change. Ethan had spent so much of his life waiting for the next step, always thinking ahead, never staying in one place long enough to be part of it. But now, standing here, watching the bioluminescent trees shift with the breeze, he realized he wasn't just leaving a planet. He was leaving something that had changed him. Aelyna knelt near the Nexus pool, her fingers grazing the shimmering surface one last time. The glow rippled outward in slow waves, responding to her touch. Her violet eyes remained focused on the liquid, but Ethan could sense what she was feeling. He felt it too. "This place was your home," he said softly, stepping beside her. Aelyna exhaled, her markings pulsing faintly. "It was my duty." She turned her gaze upward, meeting his eyes. "But I was never truly part of it," Ethan swallowed. "And now?" Aelyna studied him for a moment before standing. "Now, I choose something else." She turned, facing him fully. The morning light caught in her iridescent strands, casting shifting hues of silver and blue across her features. Ethan had never seen her hesitate before, but now she looked at him as if searching for something unspoken. Before he could question it, she stepped forward, placing her hand lightly against his chest. "The bond is real," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "I know." Her fingers curled slightly against his shirt. "Then you understand what it means." He did. It wasn't just a connection forged by the planet's energy. It was something deeper, something that went beyond simple survival or circumstance. It was trust. It was choice. It was them. Ethan reached up, his fingers brushing against the glowing markings along her wrist. "I don't plan on running." Aelyna's gaze softened, and for the first time she smiled, small but genuine. "Then we go forward." A crackle in the comm relay interrupted the moment. Ethan turned toward the wreckage, his heart pounding slightly as the ship's worn speaker came to life. "Celestial dawn on final approach," the voice announced. "Ida 10 minutes." This was it. Ethan exhaled, glancing back at Aelyna. She nodded once, and without hesitation, they walked toward the clearing together. The ship arrived as a dark silhouette against the sky, its massive structure descending through the atmosphere with controlled precision. The landing thrusters kicked up waves of dust and glowing pollen, swirling around them as the boarding ramp extended. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The finality of it. Aelyna didn't move right away. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the ship, unreadable. The golden rings in her eyes expanded slightly, flickering with the faintest hesitation. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together." Aelyna exhaled slowly, then turned to him. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, certain. "Together." They ascended the ramp, step by step, and as the hatch sealed behind them, the planet faded from view. But the bond, the choice, remained. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't stepping into the unknown alone. He was stepping towards something real,